Right now with me is Professor Cheryl Bader. She teaches criminal law at Fordham University School of Law and has been following the Weinstein case, of course, from the beginning. She's also a former assistant U.S. attorney for the state of New Jersey. First of all, your reaction to this split mixed verdict.
So this is, I think, a real victory for the prosecution and for the Me Too movement. Even though it sounds like it's a split verdict, they found guilt on what is really a top charge. In other words, the criminal sex act against Mimi Haley is equivalent to a first-degree rape. It's just that it involves sexual oral sex instead of intercourse. So that carries a very serious penalty of 25 years, up to 25 years, max, and 5-year minimum. So that's a very serious charge. Then there's also the conviction on the third-degree rape involving Jessica Mann, and that could be an additional possibility of a 4-year sentence. So the jury did come forward and find that these victims were believable, and even though it was a messy case and there were complex relationships here where the women had consensual sexual relations after the fact, the jury was not stymied by that, by rape myths or by the sense that they couldn't convict if there had been some consensual sexual relations. So I think this is a big, important verdict.
On Friday, just we got that late word with the jury asking, could they be hung on count 1 and count 3, which is the predatory sexual assault cases, and then unanimous on the other counts. What sort of message did that send to you?
Right. So, of course, court watchers love to read the tea leaves and sort of try to shake that box to see what's inside the present. But I think it did give most of us that sense that if they were moving on to the predatory sexual assault case, and that involves the necessity that it's more than one victim.
A pattern.
So, a pattern, right. It had to be at least 2. So they wouldn't get to that question unless they found guilt on the underlying count. So if they had found, if they were unanimous that he was not guilty, they wouldn't even get to the question of whether it was more than one, it was predatory. So I think this made a lot of people think, okay, a guilty verdict is coming forward. And in fact, it did.
And that would have held the life imprisonment also, as well as sentencing.
That's correct.
Potential.
But at Harvey Weinstein's age, the judge could give him 25 years
on this
and then
other
4
one
on top of it, which would be tantamount to a life sentence for him.
So let's talk about the defense and possibilities of appeal. We know that he was remanded, which that they took the bail away, right?
That's right.
Considered him a flight risk, and his health is an issue. What is next as far as appealing or what with this LA case in the future as well?
Right. So the judge decided to remand him, which is within the judge's discretion, even though the defense had asked that he remain under the same bail conditions. He can be extradited to California to face charges there as well. And I'm sure his defense attorneys will appeal the case. There'll be issues of, evidence, what evidence came in, this bad act evidence from these other victims. There was an issue about the juror, one of the jurors that was seated over there.
Juror 11.
Objections, absolutely. So I'm sure that we'll see, several issues come up on appeal. But of course, the appellate court can't take away the verdict, right? That's not what they're appealing. It's just, these rulings that a court makes.
Talk a little bit more, Cheryl, about that juror 11. There were many questions because I believe it's a woman. That person is said to be writing a book, and there were different questions, a book about an older sexual predator type person, or was it about child abuse? And so I got to say, I was surprised that she made it all the way to that point in the panel.
Right. So, the defense had used up all of their discretionary peremptory challenges. Otherwise, she would have been on the top of their list to excuse. But they only had what's called for cause. They had to convince the judge that she couldn't possibly sit as a fair and impartial juror. And one of the arguments was that she herself had been involved in writing a book that involved predatory men. And so she really would have to, she wouldn't be able to remove herself from that perspective. But one other thing that was interesting is that she downplayed that a little bit, right? When she was questioned about it, what the book was about and what her involvement was with understanding about predatory men, she downplayed it a little. And I think that was also one of their objections. Then later, during the course of the trial, they were commenting on a book that she was reading, and of course the judge said, look, jurors are allowed to read what they want to read, but they definitely did not like that juror.
No. The LA case, and we know that it's obviously coming up. How does something like this, in this world of, media is everywhere, everybody can read everything, how will that affect? We know there are 2 women alleging sexual misconduct there. What do you think? I mean, picking a jury, the charges, when his sentencing comes. I guess I was surprised it's so soon.
Right. So they're going to have the same hurdles to overcome in terms of trying to find jurors that aren't very familiar with the allegations in this case and that could sit fairly. So they'll have that hurdle to overcome, but they were able to overcome it in this case. Look, LA could make a decision that they don't want to bother trying the case and spending the money and spending the time if they wanted to. But I think they'll want to pursue the case. Those, they have victims within their jurisdiction that want justice. And I think that this is also shows that prosecutors are willing to bring these cases forward, even when you have messy witnesses that might have baggage and have continued to have relationships with their abuser. And I think it's important to move forward with this progression that we're having now to show that, that rape is something that has long been, thought of as this, man jumps out from an alley with a knife, and that there's really a complexity to rape prosecution.
Which the Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance Jr. spoke a lot about that when he first came out. Rape is rape, no matter what. Big picture here. This has been a long time, this case a couple of years, nearly 3 years, but, women have suffered for years, afraid to come out. This has brought 80 women out alleging Harvey Weinstein, and then, add on the world here.
Right.
What does this mean, these verdicts today?
Yeah, I think this has important implications for victims coming forward to see that people will believe them, even if they've had a past, even if they've, done things that under a microscope don't always, hold up that well. It used to be in rape prosecution that you could cross-examine a victim based on the clothing they were wearing or other sexual relations that they had. And, you could imply, well, they were asking for it, right? So we've moved, right, from that, but I think this takes us another step forward. There's still quite a bit of gray area around consent and what constitutes consent. And I think they'll continue to be gray, but I think that this case moves us at least a shade or 2 lighter.
Also, just in the intangibles, the forensics, we know the defense, a couple of their witnesses, let's see, memory, first of all, Deborah Davis and Elizabeth Loftus, and then Barbara Ziv, a forensic psychologist. So we're touching on several things. There's no DNA here.
Right. There was no forensic physical evidence in the case. So it all hinged on the testimony and credibility of these women, which I think was, really important for the Me Too movement. But there was a battle of the experts, but you had an expert on the defense side, which made the point that memories are not something you pull out of a file folder and it's a picture that stays the same every time you pull it out, but they're dynamic, they're subject to influence. And then the prosecution put on their, Dr. Ziv, who I think was a really key piece of the testimony here to debunk some of the rape myths that are out there, to show why women are reluctant to come forward, the shame they feel, and showed that it's very common that especially when there's an extreme power imbalance like you had here, where women will continue to try to ingratiate themselves with their abuser, will continue to have contact and even sexual contact with their abuser. So I think that was a very key education for the jurors and for us.
What about the stuff that was happening that was sort of the Rotuno writing the op-ed thing in Newsweek, and the state got very mad about that because it was as if she was speaking directly to the jurors. I mean, those are hand slaps, those are distractions, that's theater. What about things like that happened?
Right, I think all of those
the whole
things.
funeral, leaving early on Friday.
Right, well, there was definitely a lot of drama and theater throughout this whole case. But, certainly Mr. Rotuno was, a big part of that. Just her image and the image that she tried to present as the sort of powerful career woman. But also, the fact that she wrote this op-ed piece. The judge had instructed her not to, and all the attorneys not to speak with the media. But she took the position that, this was just an opinion piece about the law. And, the judge and the prosecutor, I think we're not having that. There are rules that attorneys have to follow about, when they can, talk to the media on a case, and they can't try to influence a case through these outside connections. Everything has to happen within the confines of the controlled courtroom.
Also, the fact that she's been public about being critical about the Me Too movement, where does that play?
Right. Well, I think, again, this really shows a big victory for the Me Too movement. I mean, I know she had given an interview where a lot of her rhetoric did involve that sort of blaming the victim, where she said, I wouldn't have found myself in this position. I would have been able to extricate myself. So, we know from social science research that isn't true, that we often will overestimate our ability to extricate ourselves from a difficult, stressful situation. But, no matter what, I think, there was that thought that she wanted the jurors to inhabit that mindset of, I wouldn't have let this happen to me, so therefore they must have done something wrong.
7 men, 5 women. As a prosecutor, you do not handle cases like this, right?
No, I didn't handle rape cases.
Okay, so, but 7 men and 5 women in a case that is so personal, and for the most part, it's gender we're talking about here. Oh. How do you believe things went with the cross-examination by defense attorneys, especially on all the notes for Annabella Sciorra readbacks, and it got pretty tough. Also on Mimi Haley. It's a tough job being a prosecutor, obviously, but you're also representing someone you believe is innocent. But
right.
I don't know if that's even a fair, thing for me to say, but tearing them up.
Right. Look, the defense has their only obligation is to their client.
I mean, as a defense, right?
Right. I mean, look, there's certain rules that they have to follow, but you want to litigate that case and represent your client zealously up to the line. And so the defense needed to do that. Mm-hmm. And a lot of this was to try to undermine the credibility of these witnesses. And there were things to poke holes in, right? There was inconsistency in the testimony. Look, just the very fact that they had these loving emails that really sort of, colored, how should we look at this case? The fact that they had continued sexual relations. Again, I'm glad that, that they had an expert that could educate them that this is actually quite common. But still, right, for many people, when you're talking about, someone's liberty and life, right, you want to make sure that there isn't a reasonable doubt. And so the defense job is to try to create that doubt anywhere they can. So it was perfectly appropriate and the right thing to do, even though, right, we feel for those victims. And that's why sometimes it's hard for victims to come forward and put themselves through that scrutiny. But I think this case has moved things along, and I think that victims might be less reluctant to come forward, at least seeing that prosecutors are willing to stand by them and believe them.
The courage. We keep coming back to the courage it took for them all along the way. We were just showing some video of Harvey Weinstein, 67 years old, and our reporter Alice Gaynor, who was in the courtroom the whole time, and just talking about the walker and the questions from the state about the walker and the back surgery. How does something like that, as far as jurors, what are they seeing?
Right. I mean, I think, look, he had back surgery, and it's hard to know whether he needs to rely on that walker or not. But certainly the defense wanted to make the most of juxtaposing, right, this, what the prosecution is saying is this hulking, massive, 300-pound man who was, forcing these women, and because forcible compulsion is one of the key elements that they have to prove. And when you look at that image juxtaposed with this sort of, feeble figure, over his walker with the, with either the wheels or the tennis balls, it creates that image that, he is not, this forced rapist.
But listen to the testimony. Right.
Listen
to the testimony.
Right. The jury was able to see past, I think, a lot of the drama, and it seemed like they were taking their role very seriously, parsing through, what really were a lot of difficult legal issues and also social issues in trying to decide what constitutes consent, and how does the fact that this person has this, extreme power and is willing to manipulate that power to get what he wants from these victims, this was a lot for the jury to digest and to grapple with. I mean, these are issues we're grappling with in society.
As a whole.
And, I'm sure it wasn't lost on them that we're all watching, for their verdict, and that it would have these wide implications.
You spoke earlier about court watching, being a court watcher, of course, and just talking about the complexities of this from the get-go, the way the charges were initially spelled out, but then the verdict sheet had them in a different order. And then there were issues about the instructions, and you had to really pay attention.
Yes.
I mean, as a court watcher, is it fair to ask, kind of grade it, or,
Well, it's a confusing situation, right? The jury is hearing less than an hour of instruction on the law and complicated legal issues involving reasonable doubt, involving, how to go through the different lesser included charges. So, this is tough stuff for them, and they're not getting that much guidance. But it was particularly complicated here because the top counts, the predatory count, relied on the underlying count. In other words, you had to first find that there was either, the rape involving Jessica Mann or the sexual assault involving Mimi Haley before you get to the idea of whether there was more than one and whether it was predatory. So on the one hand, you had to first look at the underlying count. On the other hand, the judge instructs the jury, you first go to the top count and then go to lesser included counts, because the lesser included have less elements. So if you find that all the elements aren't met on the first, then you go to the next. So it was this difficult puzzle for the jury to figure out. And we are not sure if they're filling in the puzzle by doing the framework first and then, going into the center, or, or how they're doing it. And they did ask questions that showed that there was some confusion, but they seemed to figure it out.
What a service. I mean, we always hear that the judge at the end, James Burke, today, thank you for your service. It is an American right and responsibility, and you've got lives at stake. So
absolutely,
thank you so much for helping us understand this case better. Cheryl Bader.
It was great to be here.
Always great to be here. Former assistant U.S. attorney in New Jersey, as well as a professor right down the street, criminal law. I can imagine in your classes also. Right?
Yes, yeah. This is, it has a lot of interesting topics and implications. So,
okay, thank you. We'll be right back after this. Of course, we'll have more on the Harvey Weinstein verdicts, 2 guilty counts, 3 not guilty counts. Stay with CBSN New York and our website, cbsnewyork.com, and of course, CBS 2 News at 5 and 6. We'll be back in a minute.